Hello, everybody. It's Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies here, and today I'm going to be talking about craving and addiction. And I'm going to be basing it on a book by Ronald Ruden called The Craving Brain, which, although it's an old book, was way ahead of its time in terms of its neuroscience and the way it looks at what causes craving. Because the real thing, the really important thing I want to say to you is it's not a matter of willpower. Okay, and willpower will maybe help you get along for a while, but it will ultimately fail because it's only 10 to 15% of your brain's processing. The rest all happens in the back brain, which is all about survival and or kind of emotions. Emotions help you bond and attach to care, and in your earliest years, that's really important for your survival. So it's basically a survival response gone wrong. That's what craving is. And sadly, we've had another instance of an unnecessary and untimely death this week with the death of Liam Payne, who was one of the young men who became famous in One Direction, which was the biggest boy band of all time. He got involved when he was 16, which is still a very early age when your brain is still developing. And, you know, that overwhelming achievement when he was very young, undoubtedly felt fantastic at the time. But of course, it's unbalanced because you get everything you've ever wanted all in one go. And then, of course, as you grow older and you're no longer young enough to be in a boy band, then you have to make it on your own. And it seems like that was really, really difficult, and is always difficult for people who've had this kind of everything coming along all at once in their life without having to sort of gradually assimilate. And if you're rejected at some point, which I believe he was recently by his record label, then a landscaped brain that is landscaped for stress is going to find it very difficult to integrate and find a grounding. There's no grounding within. So this video isn't about him, but I just thought I'd bring that up. It's such a sad, sad story. And not, you know, this happens every week, but it's just that most of the people that succumb are not well known, and so we don't hear about it. So what causes cravings and addictions? Is it a moral failure? Well, that's what we were told in the past, you know, and people were exhorted to find a path that would enable them to find the right way, by which that was often meant godliness and a faith in something to guide them because they were felt to have strayed off the path. And in fact, the 12-step program uses a lot of those theories. In a higher power, they now call it, because God is not universally believed in. So giving that over and saying, well, I'm an addict, I need to stay sober, and finding, I guess, some support, which is really important, and membership of the tribe actually has a very important function. And so 12-step programs do work for large numbers of people. In terms of keeping them sober, it doesn't actually deal with the underlying issue in the sensitized brain. And that's what I'm going to cover today. And maybe suggest other additional, let's say, or alternative methods of dealing with craving. Now, everybody has cravings of some kind, okay? Even if your craving or addiction is not one of the ones that's sort of socially regarded as a problem, like alcohol or smoking or drugs, you will, all of you and me, recognize that we have cravings from time to time, whether that's chocolate or shopping or sex or achievement. There's one that definitely I can own up to. The issue is, as I've intimated, that the brain it's three brains in one, basically, our brain. It has this phenomenal thinking and cognitive power, but that is 10 to 15% of your functioning, and the 85 to 90% of your functioning goes on underneath that or towards the back of your brain in in the emotional brain or limbic system, and the survival brain or reptilian brain. And those two together, I'm going to refer to as the back brain from now on. And they are driving actions, beliefs, and basically are behind most of the things we do, even though we overlay that with a cognitive, maybe narrative. We say, oh, well, I did this for this reason, or that person was making me do this. But in fact, you're driven via these largely unconscious processes from the back of your brain. Now, that we already knew. I think what Ronald has brought here is a very lovely schematic, a sort of a diagram of the levels at which the brain kind of takes in information and at which points we can intervene. Now, I've talked before about the inescapability of certain types of stresses, which I went through a couple of weeks ago in a paper that Ronald wrote, a more recent paper in 2019. This book actually it's an old book. It's 1997, quite a while ago, but it does take you through the way that the craving brain works. Okay, so you have a stimulus in your environment, and it might be, I don't know, the social camaraderie down the pub, or the fantastic time you're having with your friends when you're wasted. The initial initiating experience has certain characteristics that will trigger your brain to take in the information as something that is necessary for you rather than something that may have detrimental effects. And this is taken in, so that's the stimulus, okay? So it could be the clink of ice in the glass, as Ronald says in the book, or it can be anything in your environment that's sensory, that stimulates a feeling of wanting, all right, of seeking something. But for most people, that will be, resolved by finding the thing and then having a moderate amount and then moving on to something else. But for people with a sensitized brain, one that is full of unconscious, unresolvable stress from largely what happened to them in childhood, but also what's happening to them now, are not going to be able to say no to that. And in fact, what we know of addiction and severe craving is that you actually are never satisfied by the thing that you're craving. And in fact, you can only keep going until you either pass out or something else happens. So it's unstoppable because the system doesn't turn off. Now, why would that be? Okay, well, you've got the stimulus, you've got the meaning that the brain makes of that stimulus in an area called the nucleus accumbens. Don't worry about that. It's just Latin. It's a part of the brain which sort of filters the information. It's an integration center, if you like, and sends a motivational signal, something it wants you to do to satisfy that urge. And if your brain is already stressed by external events, by maybe being hormonally dysregulated, by maybe being in an emotionally unsafe environment, having these past chronic inescapable stresses, as I've said, from your childhood, if that brain is already stress sensitive or landscaped for stress, we say, you will have certain effects in that brain, which will be a low level of serotonin, which is, of course, the neurotransmitter. It's actually a neuroregulator that helps to switch off the signal. Okay, it's the regulator, and a high level of dopamine, which is your gotta have it neurotransmitter. So you've already got this imbalance driven by these chronic unconscious and some conscious stresses, which kind of set you up for not being able to switch off the signal of I've got to have this thing. So high dopamine, low serotonin. Okay. And medications, actually, what they do is they intervene beneath that level between the the brain that receives this signal of motivation and the craving itself. which is, largely dopamine driven, and will hopefully block that signal either by putting in high serotonin, or in other ways, it will dull the response. But it doesn't change the fact that your brain is already highly stressed and highly sensitized to this signal. And in the past, we would say, well, you just need to focus, on your motivation. You need to change the way you think about alcohol. That's what cognitive behavioral therapy largely does. And all of these things, medication, 12-step programs, and psychotherapy are between the landscaped brain and the craving response, but they're not looking at the pattern recognition issue, which is the stimulus above that feeds into the stressed brain. And that is really where, I guess, Ronald's ideas really come into play, because he's talking about biobalancing the brain, which is what we would now call neurological or re-regulation. There is a whole field now, it's a real buzzword, re-regulating the nervous system. But this book is obviously 20 odd years old, 25 years old, and he calls it biobalancing, which is it's a brilliant phrase. Now he's saying abstinence, okay, so not having the thing that your brain is craving, breaks the loop of the conditioned response between the brain and the action. And it substitutes instead belonging to a group, which is really talking to your survival brain about being in safety. And so while you're in the group, experiencing, connection with other people who are struggling in the same way and have the same issue, you are protected to some degree by the upsurge in serotonin that happens when you're in a safe tribe. Okay, and this is ancient stuff from when we lived in tribes, not when we lived in modern society. But as soon as you leave the group, that's where the trouble may come, because you no longer then have the support, and then the serotonin levels drop, and then the craving begins again, which is really, really hard to get out of with just normal willpower. If you give in to the craving, unfortunately, that reinforces the response, because that satisfies the dopamine hit, and your brain makes a new association that is the thing that solves the problem of the stress. So it's a very difficult problem, because relapse is so common, because it's such a powerful survival response, this feeling, and you just can't overcome it just by telling yourself not to. All right. So stressors can be, as I've said, a physical stressor, like, you have an infection, or you damage, break a bone, or have some kind of accident. It could be hormonal irregularities, which really will interfere with the way you feel, but that's, a physical response too. It can be this chronic mental emotional stress, I don't belong, nobody knows me, I'm no good, nothing I do works, these kinds of underscoring beliefs that run in the back brain unconsciously, even though maybe in your conscious life you feel okay and feel reasonably happy. It is unfortunate that most of the stresses we perceive are not made available to the conscious brain, and so we don't always know that we're stressed. I mean, many people do, but the unconscious stresses you carry from childhood are often completely hidden from you, and you may indeed think you had a perfectly okay childhood, as I did. But there were things going on, maybe family secrets, maybe tensions in the home, maybe you were bullied at school, maybe your birth was difficult, and your parents are unhappy in the marriage, or there's sibling rivalry. Maybe you have a sort of chronic illness in the family. All sorts of things can interfere and make this landscaping pattern. And they heighten this sensitivity to fear, worry, and guilt, which is, the primary emotions that result from a stressor in the system. And unfortunately, the way human brains work is that we're so well advanced in some ways that we have this self-awareness, what some people call consciousness. And that was a huge evolutionary leap to become self-aware. So we kind of have an overall sense of self, and we have a sense of things being not right. We can imagine the future. We can remember the past. And as far as we know, that is unique to us. We don't know for sure, of course, but we certainly sense that we worry more than other creatures. We certainly have more emotional overlay. That's the mammalian brain, and that's there in order to, as I have intimated, it's to allow connection when you're very young so that you will be looked after, you'll be nurtured. But emotions can run havoc in adult life. And so if you're tormented by fear or anxiety, it's largely because these unconscious responses are trying to be resolved and the conscious brain is trying to make sense of them. But because they're originating from back brain, unconscious memories and beliefs, it's very hard to resolve them consciously. And it's very hard to do it on your own as well, because even if you have this awareness and maybe you're doing meditation or you're doing some kind of inner work, if your body unconsciously feels unsafe for whatever reason, doesn't feel emotionally held or supported, you're not going to be able to release the emotions that you're carrying, because the back brain represses very, very strongly those emotions that it deems too dangerous to be felt. All right. And so many people are completely cut off from their emotions for that reason and can't feel them. So it is really a problem of the human experience. And, there are many fears that we carry just by our very nature. The fear of death, that's kind of hardwired in. A fear of failure or indeed success, maybe also there. A fear of loss, that's a really big one for very many people. All accumulate over your lifetime, okay? And so this is why I think these symptoms that you may get, anxiety, pain, fatigue, tend to come along as you age. We're seeing them younger and younger, though, these days. And, it's driving a seeking behavior. So the brain is trying to resolve it for you, but it's maybe directing you in the wrong way. It's saying, calm the system, seek this thing that once or twice or several times has given you a sense of release from the stress that you're under. And the seeking system, which is the dopamine release, is really, really powerful. So how do you embed a sense of safety that's not related to a substance or an activity that is, longer term damaging to you? Well, this is where I think Ronald's book and his concept of havening is really powerful. And he's talking about using the power of touch in order to stimulate brainwaves in the brain and therefore neurotransmitter release as well. The two things go hand in hand. And in particular, in the book, he talks about alpha waves. Obviously, they've changed that more recently and talked about delta waves. And they're just different frequency waves in your brain. Now, my understanding of brain waves is that the fastest brain wave is gamma, and that's really kind of transcendent states. We don't often experience gamma unless we're very highly experienced meditators or gurus. Beta is the one that most people are in when they're kind of really, really focused and pushing themselves. I think of it as busy beta or beta if you're American, because it's a way of remembering. It's the one when you're really busy and you're focused, but it's not particularly pleasant. It feels stressful, okay? And then there's alpha, which is more in the flow of life and kind of you're focused, but it's more gentle. There's a kind of awareness of time and self. Then you've got theta and delta, and those are the two slower waveforms. Theta is more the contemplative. You're just going into, it's the before sleep stage, and the delta wave is when you're asleep. Now, I'm a little surprised that they that havening, which is simply self touch down the arms, would stimulate delta waves, but it apparently does. And you see in the graphs of the tracking of the brain waves that it's the lower frequency states that it really enhances. So you get delta and theta in particular. And so it's helping to biobalance. Can you feel that sense? It's helping to biobalance your brain waves, which changes the way your neurotransmitters are released. And so you get a higher serotonin and a lower sense of dopamine. And so you're not quite as driven and you feel calmer. And you see with many people that their levels of stress, as assessed by themselves as a sort of self-awareness scale, do tend to drop. And, you know, I think if we can tackle some of these problems in schools, in prisons, in all instances where people are under stress, it would be great in the corporate culture and in the music industry to understand that certain people are more susceptible to stress than others, and we need to flag that up and teach them these new methods that are coming on stream. I talked last week about tapping. That's another one where you're stimulating certain nerve centers in the head, neck, and face, which I believe helps balance the vagus nerve. That's another one, and EMDR, which is eye movements, which also seems to stimulate memory, but allows the part of the brain that maybe is holding on to unresolvable emotional memories for you to know that they're over. And so all of these psychosensory therapies do seem to help greatly to calm the system, which is what's driving the craving. So next week, I'll talk a little bit more about the multi-dimensional approach of this kind of touch-based psychosensory therapy. And I'll maybe use his more recent book, When the Past is Always Present, because I think that's his opus and is the kind of book that really changes the way you think about the human experience. Unfortunately, it's quite dense and technical, so I'm hoping to dilute that down a little bit for you. Well, I hope that was helpful. And although I haven't come up with a magic solution, there are means and ways of working with a therapist largely to help balance your brain and to give you a sense of internal safety. That's what we do. And so I don't want anyone to feel that they're stuck and they can't escape the way they feel. If any of this sounds interesting to you, do get in touch and take care of yourselves and see you next week. Bye for now.